Hi guys, and welcome back to my channel. Today we're going to continue on with the tutorial of the coat that I've been working on the last several weeks, and we're going to finish it up today. It's going to be a little bit of a longer video like the last one, but I'm sure that's fine. And yeah, with that, let's just jump right into it. So while we're at it, let's also finish the outer collar that will sit on the inside. I know it's a little bit confusing, but essentially the outer collar is the bigger one because it has to warp around the inner collar. Therefore, you know, it needs to be a little bit bigger, but it will be sewn onto the inside of the coat. I think that makes sense. So let's go ahead and close the collar seam with the outer collar and outer collar stand. Same thing as for the inner, like that. Let's also iron the seam allowance into the collar stand. Let's grab our two front facings and also close that dart right here. Same thing as for the front piece. So I'm just going to put right sides together here and close this dart on both sides and iron it open. So for the facing, we want to actually also iron the ditch of the seam right here where the dart is towards the inside here, so where there is no embroidery. And there's also a fold line down here. So I also want to iron in that fold line while I'm at it, because that is how the piece will sit in the very end, as it's gonna fold around the front piece. So this is what it ends up looking like, with a very neat and nice edge up here. Okay, so with that now prepped, I'm gonna add the back neck facing to this whole thing like that. And I also added this little hanger right here so I can hang up my coat whenever needed. I think that's a little cute detail. I just used like a pleather band, I guess, some sort of that. You can use, you know, a metal thing. There are a few nice ones out there as well, or whatever you want. So now I'm gonna put this right here. You need to make sure that your neckline, which is here, continues on over your back neck facing to the other side. You don't want to add it like this or any other way. This needs to continue on. So let's go ahead and put right sides together of back neck and front facing and close the shoulder seams, which this is what that is. Let's iron the seam allowances open. And now we can add the outer collar to this whole thing as well. So same thing as for our shell. We have our seam right here where the collar gets attached. You match up the center back on the outer collar with your back neck facing center back, and then your shoulder seam with the notch in the outer collar stand. And then we have this pivoting point as well. And you want to make sure that the seam allowance here faces into the collar stand and the seam allowance of your dart is open like that. And repeat on the other side, and sew all of this together. And same thing as for the shell, I want to sew the seam allowance into the collar stand. So I'm gonna essentially understitch, but just gonna say that I'm gonna do a top stitch about 5 millimeters next to this whole thing, like next to the seam here. And that'll also fix the hanger right here better in place. So now it is kind of, you know, dangling in there, but once this is fixed here in place, it just holds up better. So let's go ahead and do that. Now, because of how the lapel is shaped in this coat, it's actually easier to put this on here. So I'm just gonna lay the coat right sides facing up, and then I'm gonna put my outer collar right sides facing onto it, matching up the center back, then obviously the collar seam here and the hemline, and all of the in-between should fairly match up. Just make sure to just ease everything together. For me, since the outer collar is embroidered, it is trying to be smaller than it should be. It should be bigger, so if you're not embroidering your piece, you won't have any problems with that at all. And then down here it also has to match up. They are the same length, so just put them together here, and repeat the same on the other side, and sew the pieces together. Essentially, that's all you gotta do. No weird gorge line or anything like that where you have to be super careful with this, because we have this kind of shawl collar. You know, there is no edge or whatever that we have to sew around. This is fairly easy, so let's go ahead and sew these two pieces together. So let's turn this right sides out. We don't have to cut anything down or whatsoever or anything else like that. We just need to turn everything right sides out and iron, because there are no corners, nothing. This is just a straight line, so fairly easy in comparison. The difficult thing about this piece is that it is so heavy actually, and so thick, for me at least. That's where I'm having problems with, or you know. So let's go ahead and turn this into a real coat by ironing the seam. And since the facing will be visible over the whole section where we just sewed the pieces together, I'm going to iron the ditch of the seam towards the shell side, all around. And I definitely want to add a top stitch to secure everything in place, probably at 1 centimeter, something rather large, because this coat is a big coat, so I feel like anything smaller would just look ridiculous, but I'm gonna iron first. So there is another seam down here at the hem that we need to finish before we top stitch everything, or like once around the whole piece. So there is the seam that we just ironed, and we're just gonna unfold this and fold right sides together here until the fold line of our collar meets this point at the hem where the hem facing starts. And we want to match up the stitching lines again. So in my hem, I'm going 1 centimeter in from all sides, and in my front facing, I'm gonna go 1 centimeter up at my facing notch. So these two seams have to match up, and then the rest can just be pinned together. And then I'm gonna sew from that point that I pinned all the way to the other seam, and do the same on the other side. And then we can start sewing around the perimeter of our collar. Let's turn the hem right sides out. Also, let's clip away that corner, and then we turn everything right sides out, like that. It's also good to iron. We want the ditch of the seam on the front side, not on the facing side. And here we can also clip into the seam allowance so that we can iron correctly, like so. And now we can go ahead and from that point sew all around the collar at 1 centimeter. So I've put my coat now onto my dress form just to determine the button placements. So all of these buttons that you can see that are now pinned on the outside of my coat are just for aesthetic reasons. Frankly, I am not gonna put any buttonholes in this coat just for the sake of my sanity, because it's just not gonna work. It is so thick, like my machine is never gonna be able to go through all these layers. So I opted to go for, you know, these outside buttons that are just purely aesthetic, and then on the inside I'm gonna add some magnetic buttons that are just gonna sit here on the facing and then on the embroidered part on the other side. So now I can go ahead and I'm probably just gonna draw a circle around this where I placed them. Now I have 6 in total. You probably can't see the lowest row, but essentially this is what it looks like, and then another 2 buttons below that at the same distance to the other ones. And I'm just gonna sew them on by hand, leaving the facing, you know, open. I'm not gonna attach the facing to the buttons, but I'm gonna go through the 2 layers of collar or lapel and then the front on this side, so that it is, you know, fixed down onto the coat, but then the facing I'm just gonna treat separately because I need to add the lining and everything. So 3 layers will be fixed together, facing will be separate. And on this part right here, I'm not going to touch anything until the coat is completely done. So I'm not going to add any buttons, the magnetic buttons in this case, to any other area here. As of right now, I'm just going to go purely aesthetic for this now and add the buttons here. And I can also add buttons to the sleeve wherever I want to, because right here, for example, I have a pin in so that the rain guard doesn't, go wild and do this. So I want the rain guard to be fixed to the sleeve at some point. So I'm gonna check where I want to do that and also add an aesthetic button right here. So let's go ahead and remove this very carefully. First, I'm gonna draw around the buttons to secure the places. And then once I take the whole piece down, I am also going to measure if everything is at the same distance, because I want this obviously to be correct and symmetrical. And now I'm also going to pin the layers that I want to fuse together. I'm going to pin those together as well and take off the buttons. Okay, let's take the coat off, make some room here, and sew the buttons on. So I'm going to repin everything here now so that the facing is not part of what I pinned. And I have to start from the outside. Okay, and now I can sew all the buttons on here. The shell is almost completed. I'm going to continue with the lining now, and I'm going to put the lining together as normal. I'm not going to leave a hole in the sleeve because I don't think it's possible to actually turn everything around through that hole in the sleeve. I think it's just gonna rip apart because this coat is so big and so heavy that I doubt that this lining will hold up. So I'm just gonna put everything together and then sew it in and turn everything around through the hem and then just, stitch it back up by hand. I think that's the best solution. And then I can also show you how to stitch up the hem facing and all of that stuff. So let's get going. I have my back piece right here, and the back piece has this fold line right here. A movement fold is what it's called. And to me the easiest is, at the moment, the lining is already folded in half because we cut it out on fold. So I'm just gonna press this fold a tiny bit more so that it stays. And then I'm gonna go ahead and stitch in the stitching line that is on the pattern. So up here you should have a notch that indicates the actual center back. And I'm gonna stitch down this kind of round shape, which is gonna fix the movement fold in place like this. And then I'm gonna go in a curved way, and I'm just gonna top stitch here this shape, and I'm gonna do the same to the bottom, so at the hemline, but this is just gonna be a bit longer. You can find, as I said, the exact stitching line on the pattern, so just copy that, and here you're gonna stitch there as well. So let's go ahead and do that. And once that's in place, we're gonna unfold and iron along the center back to create the actual center back, and therefore also this movement fold right here that you need in all coats, all jackets. Otherwise you're just not gonna have the best fit. And you're going to iron the fold to either side, it doesn't matter. Okay, and that is the back already done. So let's go ahead and put the sleeves together. And the sleeves just have that one seam, the sleeve dividing seam right here that we need to put together. So let's put right sides of back and front sleeve together and close the sleeve dividing seam. Let's iron the seam allowance to the back sleeve, and we can put the sleeves aside for now. Grab your back lining again and put your front lining right sides together with your shoulder seams and close those. Go ahead and iron the seam allowance into the back, and then we can already put our sleeves in. So you can always determine where the sleeve goes with your sleeve seam right here, which sits in this case on the back of the sleeve. So I know that this sleeve right here with the sleeve seam on the right goes into this arm's eye because my back piece is right here. So let's pin these together. Sleeve shoulder notch onto shoulder seam, front sleeve notch onto front sleeve notch in my arm's eye, and then the dividing seam goes together with the back sleeve notch, and then obviously the side seams need to match up too. There should be not too much easing involved, as both of these are basically the same length. So let's go ahead and sew the sleeves in. Let's iron the seam allowance into the sleeve. And then we can already go ahead and sew the side seams together. So let's put the sleeve side seam together, the underarm, and then obviously also the hem like this. And repeat the same on the other side. Let's iron the seam allowance towards the back. And then our lining is already done and we can put it onto our shell. So one thing that I want to prep my lining and then also a few spots in the shell are these 4 little strips. So I am using my facing fabric right here that I used for my rain guard and then also for the pocket flaps, because this is a sturdy material. It doesn't matter what material you use, it just needs to be low profile and sturdy. So you can use muslin or any other type of fabric that you have that meets these criteria. And I'm going to sew them onto 2 spots in my lining. So I'm going to sew them onto my shoulder seam, in my arm's eye seam, up here at the shoulder, right at the shoulder notch. It doesn't matter how you sew them on, where, whatever. So it just needs to be around that area. Here, just bar tack it on. And then I'm gonna sew on another one right here at the underarm. Same thing, it just needs to be sturdy and bar tacked on, doesn't need to be pretty. And these are the 2 spots. So I'm just gonna repeat that for the other side. And these then also get sewn onto the shell, which prevents the lining from, coming out of the coat when you take off the coat. So this is just a convenience thing that is in any coat that you buy, because it's just very annoying if you always have to re-put the lining into your sleeve. So you just do this little trick right here and everything is fixed in place. So let's bar tack these 4 pieces in. Okay, and now it's time to actually put everything together. So this is gonna be the fun part, and I don't mean that. So I'm gonna leave the hem open as I already said, and I'm gonna start pinning the lining right sides onto my facing right here. And starting off at the center back, that is marked with a notch right here. And I'm just gonna work my way around until I reach the hem area, because there we have the facing and that's gonna be a little different and stuff like that. So we're gonna see how we do that. Let's match up the shoulder seam, and then I think the rest is just straight down all the way up to the hem. And the lining should meet the end of the front facing right here. Okay, let's go ahead and sew around the facing and sew the lining on. Okay, and once we flip this whole thing around, hopefully without destroying anything, this already looks like a coat. It's my favorite moment, when all of this, ugly stuff in the center is covered up by the lining. So that's what that looks like. And it seems to have worked out pretty nicely. Okay, then onto the sleeves. So the sleeves are a bit fiddly because obviously you have the lining sleeve, but then you also have the shell sleeve, and we need to fuse these 2 pieces together. So I like to go in from the lining right here while trying to see where my side seam is, which is right here. This seam right here. You can also check, because the seams need to match up with the seams in the shell. So I know that this is my side seam right here, and I'm holding it with my left hand. And now I'm going in between the shell and the lining layer, out through my sleeve, and I'm grabbing my shell side seam and my lining side seam like this. So right sides together already. And I'm having a firm grip on that, and I'm pulling that out through my 2 layers that I went in. So I'm coming out of the hem essentially. And now I know exactly which seams go together, because if you don't do that, you might run into a twisting problem. So your lining might twist in your sleeve and you can't actually wear your coat. That's why I like to do it this way. And now I'm just pinning both layers right sides together, and I can sew the sleeve, lining and shell together. like that, and I'm gonna go around here and repeat on the other side. I am going to go into my sleeve and, put right sides out again. You can also use your rain guard to pop the sleeve back out. Just be careful if you have any pins in there so that you don't stab yourself. And I'm going to top stitch the hem. The hem facing is already attached to my sleeve shell, so I know that I need 4 centimeters, this distance here, and I'm going to just pin that in place throughout the whole hem. Obviously, you can use a ruler for that. I'm just gonna eye measure. And if you put the interfacing on correctly at the sleeve hem, it should automatically lay exactly where the interfacing stops. So that creates like this natural fold line that you can also feel. Like I feel that right here, the interfacing stops, and here is exactly where the fold line needs to be. That will be 4 centimeters. And I'm gonna start underneath my rain guard at probably like 3 centimeters, something like that, so that my facing is sewn in place. Obviously, you want to have your lining out of the way. You don't want to stitch over that. And that is going to, in the end, result in this nice little movement fold here in the lining as well, because the lining is, 4 centimeters total longer, and therefore like folds over 2 centimeters times 2, and that creates this as well. So let's do the 3 centimeter top stitch here. So before moving over to hand sewing the rest, there is one thing that we can do by machine, which is fixing these little thingies to the shell. So this is my underarm thingy, which I'm going to just put right where the underarm in my shell is, and I'm just gonna bar tack it onto the seam allowance. Very easy, doesn't need to be nice or anything, it just needs to be strong. And then the same thing I'm gonna do to the one up here that is for the shoulder seam. So I'm gonna get my shoulder seam out right here, or like my arm's eye where the shoulder seam is, and I'm gonna put this on here as well and bar tack it onto the seam allowance. That way your lining is not gonna come out of the sleeve when you take off your coat. So let's bar tack these in place, and then we can continue sewing everything else by hand. So at the moment here, everything is only held in place by these 2 pins. But obviously, if you want to hang up your coat somewhere, this needs to be strong. And therefore, we're going to sew the seam allowances of our collar stands together by hand. So if you go inside your coat, you're going to find the 2 collar stand seams. You can very easily find them with the shoulder seam. They lead into the collar stand seam. And I am going to go over here by hand with a thick thread and just do like the kind of zigzag stitch. I'm going to show you what I'm going to do. So I have my thread here doubled, and then I'm going to start here at the shoulder seam, and I'm kind of loosely going into the seam allowance and doing this kind of zigzaggy stitch. And I'm going to end here in the shoulder seam again, and then just tie it off like that. And now once we turn everything over, this should all now, because that's how we laid it before, all of the seam allowances should face automatically into the collar stand, which they all do. And this is now fused together. As you can see, it pulls on the whole thing, not just on one layer. It pulls here on everything. All the layers if I pull on them, as you can see here. So that's the goal, so that this is strong enough to hold up the weight of the coat, and it's very heavy. So now the collar is fixed in place. That's good. The sleeves are done, and we can go down to the hem of our coat. And we have this area here where the hem facing is looking a bit funky. And what we want to do is figure out how the hem is going to lay in the end. So we have our 4 centimeters hem facing attached to the coat already. So all of this gets ironed up like so. And then we have the facing seam allowance, which is down here, and our lining seam allowance. Now the lining seam allowance just has 1 centimeter as seam allowance because it also has the movement fold, so that it is gonna sit in the end about 2 by 2 centimeters folding over top. So we only have to figure out this area up here. With the facing of our front flipped up, we can then also flip up the seam allowance of our front facing hem and kind of maneuver it in a diagonal way until we reach a 1 centimeter seam allowance at the point where the lining starts. So it's going to end up diagonal, something like this, and we're going to check from the right side, obviously, if the fold line is correct, which we want the facing to fold right here because of the embroidery. It starts here, so that is our fold line. Therefore, I'm gonna move this spot over a teeny tiny bit, and it should be at the same height or width, I guess. It should be at the same spot as your lapel ends. So that is a good orientation for this piece right here. And this is just gonna, sit like so, and we're gonna sew this in by hand. The rest of the lining will also be fixed in place by hand, but before we do any of that, we want to iron up our hem, and we're also gonna add a top stitch to that area. So I'm gonna do a 3 centimeter top stitch just as I did for my sleeve lining, so I can prep all of that by just folding at 4 centimeters plus seam allowance like that on both sides. And I'm gonna start the top stitching like somewhere under here, and it would be perfect to start it underneath here, which will be hidden, and I'm not gonna stitch down my lining, which will attach later. So I can pin my front and not my facing, so this is loose now, and therefore access everything that's underneath here. So let's just pin the lining and stuff out of the way too, and on the other side as well, like that. And now I can go ahead and start my top stitch somewhere here and go over the hemline until I reach this point right here, which will be covered by our lapel. Okay, and the rest we're gonna sew by hand. So I am probably gonna iron the 1 centimeter fold line for my seam allowance into my lining so that I can do this kind of sandwich, and then I can blind stitch along here. And now I have a guide and I can sew everything together. So let's get a normal thread, put a knot in, and start from one side. For this section right here, I'm not gonna bother doing a blind stitch. I'm just gonna do a back and forth. I'm not sure what you call all of these stitches in English, but I'm just gonna go back and forth like that because I'm not too worried about seeing or not seeing this stitch. It's at the bottom, it's at the hem. I really don't care. And also the thread is the same color. I'm fine with this. And I think from here on out, I'm gonna do a blind stitch. So I'm going a rather long distance inside of the fold of my lining. And then right at that spot, I'm doing the same for my shell, so that only a small itty bitty stitch here is the one thing that connects both layers. And I'm gonna work my way along the hemline here. So I went ahead and added the buttons. These are the magnetic buttons. So I added one side of the magnetic buttons to the side that already has the buttons sewn onto. That was quite difficult because, there is not too much give anymore because of the big buttons, but I managed to sew them on, and I'm just going to mirror this placement onto the other side here. but I'm going to obviously stitch onto the embroidered side like this, so that everything is gonna line up nicely. You're gonna find the placement on the pattern itself, so you just transfer that and then you have your button placements. Just make sure that when you're placing your buttons, that you smooth out your surface so that the facing right here is folded enough towards the inside and it's not showing here anymore, so that the fold line sits nicely. And from there on, you just, fix everything in place, pin everything down, and sew the buttons on by hand. Obviously, when placing the buttons, double check that the hem lines up on both pieces, otherwise it's just gonna look funny, and that everything is symmetrical. And then I can go ahead and place the buttons. And that's it for today's video. I hope you enjoyed this big and difficult project, but I had a lot of fun doing it, and I'm super excited to wear this coat out in winter once it's really cold again, because I think this is gonna keep me warm a lot. So thank you so much for everybody for supporting me and my channel. If you haven't already, please go ahead and subscribe to my channel and ring the bell so you'll get notified every time that I post. I post on Sundays, so you can keep an eye out for that. In the meantime, if you haven't already, please go ahead and check out my Instagram or my social media in general. Links to everything is linked down below. I am doing a short format content there, hacks, tips and tricks and stuff like that, so that might be of interest to you. The link to the pattern is in the description down below. It's the first link, so that is another way to support me and my channel. Just check out my Etsy store and you can find loads of patterns. I have over 100 on my Etsy store. I'm sure there is something that you like as well. And the last way to support me and my channel is to become a member. There is the join button down below. So thank you so much for everybody for watching, and I'm gonna see you next Sunday. Bye guys!